organizations as well, so they're not anywhere near as vulnerable.
I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I'm just saying that it's incredibly infrequent. It's never affected anything that I've ever written. I would say that the changes are somewhat more subtle. For example, when I did the story on how DARE didn't work, I thought that analysis would be like a 12-inch strip, as we call it, on page 3, DARE doesn't work. But when it came to the editors, it was a more sensitive story than I had realized. And, they said, well, is this so or all that? So then they required me to go get all the original underlying studies that the meta-analysis was based on. And these underlying studies provided far more devastating information than just sort of this general study, and it sort of elevated it so that it appeared on the front page, and it was a cover story. And now I think if you read the media, it's just sort of consensus that, oh, DARE doesn't work, everyone knows that. But so there's occasionally like a higher hoop that you have to go through, and sometimes you need a more forceful personality, but it's not really that difficult. And if any of you want to be mainstream journalists, you could go and apply for a job. They'll never ask what your political beliefs are. They'll just look at your clips, see if you can write. It's open to right-wingers who say, oh, the liberal bias. I say, well, apply for a job. I mean, do something, stop complaining.
All talked about the 15 minutes of fame. I think in the last few years I've had about an hour and a half. And, well, I would agree with Dennis that I don't see that there's any great conspiracy. I think it's more like a child's game of telephone, where every layer you get away from the truth, it gets distorted a little. And I found in my dealings with the press, and this, I don't mean this as an exaggeration, if the press gets the story 40% accurate, they're doing a great job. And one exception, Dennis, I would say is, I don't know if you recall, but when you did your forfeiture story a number of years ago in USA Today, my client Jack Johnson was one of the 4 stories that was in that, and that particular story stands out in my mind as the most accurate one that I've been personally involved in, and I want to thank you for that. You did a good job of that. But I think it's more the nature of the beast. We have this giant bureaucracy, there's lots of people, it's got to go through lots of levels, and I'm thinking of the reporter that's sitting there that's, never done anything on medical marijuana, never done anything on a club, story hits, I get a call. I've been doing this for years, I'm trying to give them as much information as I can in 5 minutes that they then have to digest and put into the story. So I understand that the problem on the reporter's side. As activists, what can we do to make it easier for you guys to get it right?
Money won't work.
And
collection. When I heard that the DC lawyer say that he had written a letter to the editor, I think that's effective in a way, but in a way you're staying over on one side of the wall because you people sort of have philosophical beliefs you're trying to get apart. To me, the most effective thing would have been is to call and leave a voicemail on the reporter's mail and say, I'm a DC lawyer, this is my thoughts, I'm available. If you do any further stories on the issue that I'd like to be, the dissenting opinion, please give me a call. And most of the time, he would then give you a call or use someone else of similar that sort of breaks the myth of consensus. I would think persistence and politeness, but particularly persistence, because the reason you don't see many legalization letters to the editor in the Post anymore is people are bored with it. Oh, people have said that. There's nothing new. What's the new angle to it? So newspapers are always looking for something fresh. And I think that's the problem. So maybe I think it's actually, as Dick is pointing out, maybe a little more insidious than a conspiracy because there's no one pulling the levers. It's just...
One of the things I think the problem we have is that we talk about a lot of little lies. But the big problem for journalists and for the newspapers and for the government is that they want a big lie. And that how in the world are they going to tell the American people the truth about what has been done to them under marijuana prohibition? That it is from someone who talks about this, writes about this every day, it is extraordinarily difficult to describe this because one, it is so vast. It involves, at this point, so many different aspects of it, all of which we've touched on here. And then all of it, as Mike has said, is based on lies and nonsense, absolute, complete and totally illogic things that you could happily call it crazy. And that is simply too big a story. And particularly if you're the editor of an establishment thing like the Washington Post that is deeply complicit in this. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Washington Post company, like the drug czar, like Bill Clinton, they have blood on their hands. They are responsible for the death of Mario Haas. They are responsible for the arrest of Will Foster. They have blood on their hands. And that is not something that can be told in a short story.
Well, my final comment would be that we have to work towards cutting the legs out from underneath the propagandists.
Yep.
The latest story that really upset me quite a bit that came down the pike was the cancer scare story out of California. I forget the doctor. The neck and head cancer story that went out, and that's one of those classic marijuana myth stories that gets repeated over and over again in the press, especially in the mainstream, and doesn't get comments from reputable medical people such as Lester or Lester Greenspoon or others here in this room to comment on such a subject with such great consequences. Yet they go with, well, marijuana causes cancer, and that's that. Obviously, we have to fight to change that kind of coverage. And I was upset in the Daily News coverage in New York from some doctor who just reported it as fact, as in why wasn't there a counter view on this. And so that's, to me, those are the types of stories that we have to constantly fight against and do our best, with all the, what we have to work at our disposal, with all the great minds in this room and all the media outlets that we do have some say in. Obviously, what we can do in High Times and other places, on the net, talk radio, and all these, different media where we can have our say and counter the arguments of the propagandists.
If I might at this time, before we acknowledge the panelists who have been fascinating, I just wanted one comment on the drug testing question that was asked of Dennis in the newspaper. I want to assure you that this was a matter discussed by the normal board at great length at some point, and we were instructed to give drug tests to all potential new employees, and if they pass, they don't get hired. Thank you for this panel, and it's now lunchtime, folks, and it's right across the hall. Thank you.
Stand and think tank, crossfire, and politically incorrect. Before joining the Cato Institute, David served as editor of the New Guard magazine and as executive director of the Council for Competitive Economy. David Bowes is probably best known these days as the author of Libertarianism, a Primer, and the editor of The Libertarian Reader, both of which received very favorable reviews in newspapers and magazines across the country. The noted scholar Richard Epstein called the Libertarianism a Primer, quote, a readable and informative account of the basic principles of libertarian thought, written by someone steeped in all aspects of the tradition. David Bowes' Primer unites history, philosophy, economics, and law, spiced with just the right anecdotes to bring alive a vital tradition of American political thought. And the Reader has been described as, quote, the most magnificent collection of libertarian writings ever published. David also serves on the board of directors of NORML and on the advisory board of the Drug Policy Foundation. It is indeed my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, David Bowes.
Thank you, Keith. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to see so many people out for the first drug reform conference of the new millennium. Unless you're particular about calendars. And I want to welcome you all to Washington, even though in general I think people should stay as far away from Washington as possible. We're glad to have you here for a purpose like this. I was talking the other day to a surgeon, an engineer, and a politician. And the question came up, late at night about what was the world's oldest profession. And the surgeon said, well, when God made Eve from Adam's rib, that was a surgical operation. And the engineer